Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. I never believed in curses. That was until I met her. It all started when my Aunt Miriam passed away unexpectedly. She was a reclusive woman, the kind that most of the family barely knew. I hadn't seen her in years, but her death hit my mother hard, and I decided to help her settle Miriam's estate. I didn't know much about her, but there was one thing that everyone did know. She collected dolls, hundreds of them. Porcelain, wooden, fabric, you name it. The house was full of them, or so I had been warned. Stepping into the house felt like walking into a time capsule. The air was thick with dust, the kind that stuck to your skin and clothes as you moved through the narrow hallways. The walls were lined with shelves, every surface covered with dolls. Some were beautiful, others were unsettling. Their glassy eyes followed me as I moved, or so it felt. The house creaked with every step I took, and despite the sunlight pouring in through the windows, it felt dark inside. It was as if the weight of years of solitude clung to every surface. My aunt had lived here alone for as long as I could remember, with only her dolls for company. The second day of clearing out her things was when I found the letter. It was tucked inside one of the drawers of Miriam's desk, yellowed and brittle, with my name scrawled across the front in shaky handwriting. Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. The words made me pause. I read on. I thought I could handle them. I thought they were just dolls. But I was wrong. There's something attached to them, something old and dangerous. I'm too far gone now. But you still have a chance. Whatever you do, don't take the dolls. Leave them here. Burn them if you can. They're cursed, Ethan. They feed on your fear. The letter ended abruptly. The ink smeared as though it had been written in haste. My heart was racing, but I laughed it off. A curse? Seriously? My aunt had clearly lost her grip on reality in her final days. But still, her words lingered, and that night, I found it difficult to sleep. The next morning, I resumed the tedious task of boxing up her things. I avoided the dolls as much as I could. They made me uncomfortable. They were too lifelike, especially the older ones. Some were chipped, their once pristine faces cracked from age, but others looked as though they had been meticulously cared for. Too cared for, if you ask me. I was in the living room, wrapping up a particularly old doll in bubble wrap when I heard it. A whisper. Soft. Almost like a child's voice. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The voice was so faint, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But then I heard it again. Ethan. It was unmistakable. My blood turned cold, and I spun around, my eyes darting to the shelves lined with dolls. They stared back at me, their painted eyes glistening in the dim light. I forced a laugh. Stress, I muttered to myself. Just stress. But the feeling of being watched never left. It only grew stronger. By late afternoon, I was glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. Each time, I swore the dolls had shifted positions. I knew it was impossible, but I couldn't shake the sensation. That night, I barricaded myself in the guest room. I needed a night away from them, from the eyes, the whispers. It was the only room without dolls. I made sure of that before I settled in for the night. As I lay there, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were soft, barely audible, like a child's feet padding across the wooden floor. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was the house settling, old wood groaning under its own weight. But the sound was rhythmic, deliberate. I pulled the covers up to my chin, listening intently. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. My breath hitched in my throat, and for what felt like an eternity, I lay there, frozen in fear. Then, The door creaked open, slowly, inch by inch. Nothing moved in the doorway, but I knew something was there, waiting. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first rays of sunlight broke through the window, I threw the door open and stormed out of the room. I couldn't spend another night in that house. I needed to leave. I packed up my things, ready to return home and leave my aunt's bizarre world behind. But when I tried to open the front door, it wouldn't budge. I twisted the lock, tugged at the handle, but it was stuck. Panic started to set in. I rushed to the back door, but the same thing happened. Every window was sealed tight. The house had trapped me. As I stood in the living room, contemplating how to escape, I heard it again. The whisper. This time, it was louder, clearer. "Ethan, why didn't you listen?" I turned, and there, in the center of the room, was a doll I hadn't noticed before. It was larger than the others, dressed in a faded blue gown, with porcelain skin and bright, glassy eyes. But something was off. Its face. It seemed to be smiling now. I blinked, and the doll took a step forward. My heart raced as I stumbled back, unable to take my eyes off it. The doll's movements were jerky, unnatural, but it was moving. There was no denying it now. I turned and ran, but every hallway I entered, every corner I rounded, there were more dolls. Dozens of them, all watching me, all waiting. They weren't where I had left them. My breathing became ragged as I reached the attic stairs. I remembered there was a small window up there, my last chance of getting out. I raced up the steps, slamming the door behind me, and braced myself against it. Silence. For a moment I thought I was safe. But then, from the other side of the door, I heard scratching, like tiny hands clawing at the wood. I didn't wait. I scrambled to the window and threw it open, but it was too small to squeeze through. My mind raced. I needed a way out. I glanced around the attic, desperate, when I spotted something, a large chest in the corner. It was locked, but I could feel something drawing me toward it. Maybe it was a weapon, or a tool, or something that could help me escape. I pried it open with a crowbar, and inside was another doll. This one was different. It was ancient, its eyes missing, its face cracked and worn, but it radiated something dark and malevolent. I understood then what my aunt had meant in her letter. This was the source. This doll was the heart of the curse. I had to destroy it. I grabbed it, but the moment I touched it, the air around me grew cold. The attic door burst open, and the dolls, the ones that had been chasing me, stood there, watching, waiting. I could hear their whispers now, all of them, overlapping and echoing inside my head. Stay with us. Forever. I slammed the doll onto the floor, shattering it into pieces. The room erupted in a deafening scream, a sound that pierced through my skull, making me fall to my knees. The dolls, every single one of them, began to collapse, their porcelain bodies cracking and crumbling into dust. I don't know how long I sat there, in the middle of the wreckage, but eventually the whispers stopped. The air grew still. The dolls were gone. I left the house that morning and never looked back. But even now, weeks later in my new apartment, I still feel like I'm not alone. Late at night, I hear soft footsteps outside my door. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the faintest whisper. "Ethan, why didn't you listen?" I had always considered myself a seasoned hiker, someone who could navigate even the most uncharted wilderness with ease. But that was before I encountered the strange, unsettling mystery that would forever haunt me. It started with a casual hike in Yosemite National Park, a place known for its breathtaking views and seemingly endless trails. Little did I know, my life was about to change in ways I couldn't have anticipated. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out, the kind where the sun filters through the trees in golden shafts, and the air is filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. My name is Jake Thompson, and at 34, I'd tackled numerous trails across the country. But Yosemite had always eluded me, and this trip was my chance to conquer it. As I trudged up the trail, the serenity of the park was almost hypnotic. The towering pines and the distant roar of a waterfall provided a peaceful backdrop to my thoughts. It wasn't until I reached a seemingly unremarkable junction that things began to unravel. The trail split into 3 directions, each as inviting as the next. I decided to take the middle path, driven by a hunch that it would lead me to some hidden treasure of nature. Hours later, the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the forest floor. My initial excitement had given way to a gnawing sense of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I chalked it up to the natural anxiety of hiking alone, but the sensation grew stronger with each passing minute. That's when I noticed it, a small weathered sign partially obscured by moss. It read, "Beware the Lost Trail." I scoffed at the ominous message. What kind of serious hiker would heed a warning like that? I was about to move on when I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. I froze, straining to see through the dense foliage. The sound stopped abruptly, and the forest fell into an eerie silence. A chill ran down my spine. I decided to press on, thinking that the sensation was just a product of my imagination. As night began to fall, I realized I'd been walking for hours without seeing any signs of civilization. The trail had vanished, replaced by a disorienting maze of trees and shadows. The growing darkness only deepened my unease. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction seemed to look the same. My flashlight flickered, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to dance just beyond my reach. The forest around me was alive with strange noises, low growls, the snap of twigs, and the occasional unsettling whisper of wind through the trees. Desperation set in as I stumbled over uneven ground, and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky. I pulled out my map, though it was increasingly useless in the absence of recognizable landmarks. As I peered into the darkening forest, a sudden realization hit me. I was lost. Not just temporarily lost, but hopelessly ensnared in a place that seemed to defy reality. The hours ticked by with no sign of escape. My phone had lost signal hours earlier, and I was left with nothing but the growing dread in my gut. Then, just as I was about to resign myself to a cold night in the woods, I saw a faint light flickering through the trees. Relief surged through me as I hurried towards it, hoping it was a campsite or perhaps even another hiker. The light led me to an old, dilapidated cabin that appeared to have been abandoned for decades. The wooden structure was overgrown with vines, and its windows were dark and unwelcoming. Despite my apprehension, the prospect of shelter and possibly some help drove me to approach the cabin. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The interior was musty and filled with the scent of decay. Dust covered every surface, and old furniture lay in disarray. It was clear that no one had been here for a long time. I noticed a small oil lamp on a rickety table and decided to light it, hoping it would provide some comfort in the oppressive darkness. As the warm glow of the lamp illuminated the room, I noticed something strange. Old, yellowed newspaper clippings pinned to the walls. They were all about missing persons, hikers, campers, and travelers who had vanished without a trace in this very park. The dates on the articles spanned several decades, but the stories were eerily similar. People who had disappeared under inexplicable circumstances, never to be seen again. My heart raced as I read through the articles. Each one seemed to describe a place I had just walked through. A seemingly benign trail, a hidden path, or a spot in the woods that I now realized had been more than just a mere coincidence. A chill settled over me as I understood that this cabin was not just an abandoned shelter. It was a memorial to those who had vanished. A sudden noise behind me made me jump. I turned to see a figure standing in the doorway, a tall, shadowy silhouette. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stepped forward into the light. It was a man, disheveled and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. He looked like he had been living in the woods for years. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The man's gaze was empty, and he spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper. "You shouldn't be here. They're watching. They always are." Confusion and fear gripped me. "Who's watching?" "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he moved closer to the lamp, and I could see his face more clearly. It was pale and hollow, as if he had been consumed by the forest. He stared at me with an almost desperate look. "You need to leave. Now." I hesitated for a moment, but then decided to heed his warning. I grabbed my backpack and headed for the door, casting one last glance at the newspaper clippings. As I stepped outside, the night seemed darker and more oppressive. The forest had become an alien landscape, twisting and shifting as if it had a will of its own. The man's words echoed in my mind as I stumbled through the woods. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the unsettling sounds grew louder. I could have sworn I heard whispers, almost like voices calling my name from the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, I emerged from the forest and found myself back on a familiar trail. Exhausted and shaken, I made my way to the park ranger station, where I reported my experience. The rangers listened with concern, but offered no explanations. They assured me that I was not the first to experience such a phenomenon. When I left the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within me. The forest had revealed a hidden, malevolent presence that I couldn't understand, and the mystery of the disappearances remained unsolved. All I knew was that I had narrowly escaped becoming another name on those newspaper clippings. To this day, I avoid national parks. The woods hold a darkness that I can't explain, a lurking dread that reminds me of the man in the cabin and the voices that whispered through the trees. I'm left with the unsettling knowledge that the forest is alive with secrets, and some mysteries are best left undisturbed. I woke to the sound of heavy, uneven breathing coming from just outside my tent. My flashlight flickered in the cold, dead air, casting erratic shadows on the walls of my temporary refuge. I tried to ignore the sounds, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew better. The wilderness had always held a strange allure for me, but now, in the middle of the night, surrounded by darkness and silence, that allure felt like a cruel joke. I had come to this remote area of the Navajo Nation for some peace and solitude, far from the bustle of city life. I had hoped the isolation would clear my mind and help me finish my novel. But now, alone in the mountains, I felt an encroaching sense of dread I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the breathing, it was the distinct feeling of being watched, as though unseen eyes were fixated on me from every shadow. The Navajo stories about skinwalkers had always fascinated me, but I'd dismissed them as mere folklore, tales spun to keep children from wandering too far. That was until I found myself face to face with something I couldn't explain. I unzipped the tent flap cautiously, trying to peer through the dim light of my flashlight. The forest outside was eerily silent, the only sound my own ragged breath. I stepped out into the biting cold, scanning the surroundings. The darkness was almost tangible, a thick shroud that swallowed any hint of comfort. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. I saw it, a figure crouched by the edge of the clearing. It was humanoid but moved with an unnatural, jerky grace. Its body was hunched, and its face was obscured by a dark hood. The figure seemed to be staring directly at me, though its face was hidden in shadow. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt their gaze burn through me. I retreated back into the tent, heart pounding. This wasn't a game or a figment of my imagination. The tales I had read about skinwalkers, witches who could transform into animals and steal human faces, flashed through my mind. My rational mind argued against it, but the terror I felt was all too real. Hours passed, each moment stretched by the silence and my growing paranoia. I had to see if the figure was still there. With trembling hands, I unzipped the tent again, this time cautiously peeking outside. The figure was gone. My flashlight swept over the clearing, revealing nothing but the harsh outlines of trees and shadows. I spent the rest of the night in fitful sleep, waking frequently to check that my unwelcome visitor hadn't returned. When dawn finally broke, it brought no relief. The forest was still, too still, as if holding its breath. The silence was suffocating. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to leave the area. As I packed, I noticed strange marks on the ground, deep, irregular gouges that seemed to lead away from my tent and into the forest. They looked like claw marks, though much too large for any animal I knew of. Determined to leave, I made my way back to my car, but the sense of being followed never left me. Every snapped twig, every rustle in the underbrush set my nerves on edge. I reached my car and quickly drove away, the road winding through the forest like a serpentine escape route. I thought I had escaped whatever terror lurked in those woods, but it wasn't until I reached the nearest town that I realized the full extent of the nightmare. I stopped at a small diner to grab some coffee and calm my nerves. The old woman behind the counter watched me with a curious, penetrating gaze. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked as she poured my coffee. "No, just passing through," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. She seemed to sense something in my tone, her expression shifting to one of concern. "You didn't see anything strange out there, did you?" I hesitated, then decided to share what happened. I recounted the figure, the breathing, and the marks on the ground. As I spoke, the woman's face grew paler. "Those woods are known for more than just their beauty," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They say skinwalkers are drawn to those who enter their domain. You're lucky you're still here." Her words only deepened my unease. I tried to dismiss her warnings, attributing them to local superstitions. But as I left the diner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. My drive back to the city was long and grueling, my eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror for any sign of movement. Every shadow on the roadside seemed to stretch and writhe, taking on the grotesque forms I'd seen in my nightmares. When I finally reached my apartment, I thought I was safe. But as I unpacked my gear, I noticed something chilling. One of my belongings, a small wooden charm I kept as a memento, was missing. The charm had been a gift from a friend who believed in the protective power of such objects. Its absence felt like a taunting reminder of what I had experienced. That night, as I lay in my bed, every creak and groan of the apartment building seemed amplified. My mind raced with thoughts of the figure in the woods, the claw marks, and the old woman's warnings. I tried to sleep, but was plagued by dreams of the dark figure stalking me through the forest, its face just out of reach. In the days that followed, I tried to go about my life as usual, but the experience left a mark on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the skinwalker, or whatever it was, had followed me from those woods. Every time I was alone, I would catch myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that dark figure lurking just out of sight. I never went back to the forest, and I tried to ignore the unsettling experiences I had. But every so often, when the wind howls outside or the shadows lengthen in my apartment, I can't help but wonder if I'll ever be truly free of that terror. The wilderness had given me more than I bargained for, and the skinwalker's presence, whether real or imagined, had left an indelible mark on my soul. They say a ship's final voyage is the one that defines its legend. And if that's true, then the Harbinger was destined to become a ghost. I didn't believe in curses or the supernatural before that night, but what I witnessed on that forsaken sea changed my life forever. My name is Liam Cross, and I'm a maritime salvage expert based out of Charleston, South Carolina. On the night of January 15th, I was aboard the salvage vessel Endurance, miles off the coast, searching for wrecks to recover. We had been hired to locate and recover artifacts from a sunken ship reported lost over a century ago, the Harbinger. My client, an eccentric millionaire with a passion for maritime history, wanted anything of historical value that we could find. We left the dock just after sunset, the air heavy with the scent of salt and cold wind. The sky was a blanket of deep blue, pierced by a smattering of stars. The ocean, usually so predictable, seemed restless. I brushed it off as a quirk of my imagination and settled into my work. But as the night deepened, an unsettling feeling crept over me. It was past midnight when we detected a faint signal on the sonar, a possible wreck just as our client had described. We anchored and prepared for a dive. The crew, my partner, Greg, and a few seasoned divers, worked in practiced silence while I stayed on the deck, monitoring our position. The water was eerily calm, but the silence was broken by Greg's voice over the radio. "Liam, you better come down here. You need to see this." I descended into the abyss with a sense of unease that grew with every meter. The darkness was complete, pierced only by the lights from our equipment. As we approached the coordinates, the silhouette of the wreck emerged from the murk. A ghostly image of the Harbinger, its once proud frame now a skeletal remnant of wood and iron. The ship was in remarkably good shape, considering its age. The wooden hull, though encrusted with barnacles, was largely intact. We attached our cables and began the recovery process. As I examined the ship's deck, I noticed something odd, a nameplate on the captain's quarters. The name, Harbinger, was carved into it, though the letters were barely visible beneath layers of grime and decay. Greg and I entered the captain's cabin, where an ancient, dusty chest lay against the wall. It was locked, but it didn't take much to pry it open. Inside, we found various items, old coins, a faded journal, and a sealed envelope. My curiosity piqued. I took the envelope and slipped it into my jacket pocket. It was late, and we decided to surface and head back to port. As the sun began to rise, painting the ocean in hues of pink and gold, I sat in the cabin of the Endurance, examining the envelope. The seal was broken, and inside was a letter written in a shaky hand. It read, "To whoever finds this, beware the Harbinger. We were not alone when we left port. There's a curse upon her. Those who seek treasure will find their souls claimed by the sea. We saw them, the shadows of the crew. If you read this, it's already too late. Leave before nightfall. Captain Thomas Bellamy." I chuckled at the ominous warning, dismissing it as the ramblings of a man long gone. But as night fell, a chill settled over the ship that had nothing to do with the temperature. Greg and I went over the items we recovered. The journal was an account of the Harbinger's final days, a harrowing tale of a voyage gone wrong, plagued by mysterious disappearances and the crew's growing paranoia. According to the entries, the crew had been seeing shadowy figures and hearing strange noises. The captain's last entry was particularly unsettling. "We have seen them again, the shadows. They are not of this world. They whisper in the dark, and we know our time is running out." As I read the last line, the power on the ship flickered. Greg looked up from his work, his face pale. "Did you see that?" "Yeah, just a glitch," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. Later that night, I was woken by a sudden, violent rocking of the ship. The waves were crashing against the hull with a force I had never seen before. I stumbled onto the deck, where Greg was already frantically trying to secure the lines. The sky was black, save for the occasional flash of lightning. In the midst of the storm, I saw it, a shadowy figure moving along the deck. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was just fatigue or the storm playing tricks on me. But the figure was real. It was tall and thin, with a spectral quality that made it blend into the darkness. "Greg!" I shouted, but the wind swallowed my voice. I ran toward the figure, but it vanished into the storm. My heart raced as I scanned the deck, searching for any sign of it. There was nothing, only the storm, howling like a beast hungry for our souls. I didn't sleep that night. The storm raged on, and with it, the uneasy feeling that something was very wrong. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sea that seemed oddly calm, almost too calm. The following day, Greg was missing. His cabin was empty, his belongings gone. There was no sign of struggle, just an unsettling silence. I searched the ship from top to bottom, but he was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as I realized we were alone. The only thing left was the Harbinger, and the more I thought about it, the more I was convinced that the ship itself was a part of the curse. My decision was made. I would abandon the Harbinger and return to shore. But as I prepared to leave, a strange noise came from below deck, an old creaking like a door opening. I descended to investigate, and as I did, I heard whispers. Low, guttural sounds that seemed to come from every direction. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to writhe and shift. In the captain's cabin, I found the chest we had recovered, but it was now open and its contents were gone. The journal was the only item left, lying on the floor. I picked it up and began to flip through the pages, but they were blank. The ship seemed to groan and shift, as if in response to my presence. A sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I could no longer stay there. I grabbed my gear and fled up to the deck, desperate to leave. Just as I was about to signal for help, I saw it, the ghostly figure again, this time clearly visible in the daylight. It was a spectral version of a man in old-time sailor's garb, staring at me with hollow eyes. "Get off this ship!" I screamed, but the figure simply watched, its presence a cold reminder of the curse. I made it back to Charleston, but the experience left me shaken. The Harbinger was gone, vanished without a trace. The authorities found no evidence of the ship or my missing partner. The story of the ghost ship and its curse faded into obscurity, but for me, the memory remains vivid. I don't know what happened to Greg or why the Harbinger was cursed, but I do know that some legends are best left untouched. The Harbinger still haunts my dreams, and every time I hear the distant sound of creaking wood, I can't help but shiver. The ocean is vast, and it holds many secrets. Some are best left buried in the depths, where they can no longer claim the souls of the curious. And every night, when the sea is quiet and the stars are hidden, I remember the ghost ship that haunts the sea, knowing that some things are better left alone. The forest had always felt like a sanctuary, a place where the chaos of life fell away, leaving only the rustling of leaves and the calls of distant animals. But that night, something changed. The serenity of the wilderness transformed into a labyrinth of fear, and I was trapped within its suffocating grip. I am Ethan Blackwood, 33 years old, a nature photographer by trade. For years I've explored the world's most remote forests, seeking beauty through my lens. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened 2 nights ago, deep in the heart of the Blue Ridge Wilderness. It began with an unsettling feeling, a chill that crept over me as I set up camp for the night. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and flicker with a life of their own. I chalked it up to the usual apprehension of being alone in the woods, a feeling that was as familiar to me as the scent of pine needles underfoot. My camera's flash illuminated the trees, and I snapped a few pictures, capturing the stillness of the evening. As I reviewed the images, I noticed something peculiar, a dark shape that seemed out of place. It was faint, almost ethereal, and I could barely make out what it was. I dismissed it as a trick of the light and decided to retire for the night. Sleep, however, was elusive. The forest was unnervingly quiet, save for the occasional crack of a twig or the distant call of an owl. I lay in my tent, wide awake, my mind racing with thoughts of what I might encounter during my stay. The discomfort gnawed at me, but I forced myself to stay calm. At around midnight, a strange sound pierced the silence. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. My heart raced, and I strained to listen, hoping it was just an animal passing by. But the growl grew louder, more insistent, and then abruptly stopped. I lay there, paralyzed, until I heard it again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and, with trembling hands, unzipped the tent. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the cold air. The forest was different now. The usual comforting darkness seemed oppressive, as if the shadows themselves were alive and watching. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of movement. The growl had ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I turned to head back to the tent when I saw something that made my blood run cold, a set of large clawed footprints in the soft earth. They were unmistakable and led off into the woods, away from my campsite. I hesitated, the rational part of my mind urging me to stay put, but the photographer in me couldn't resist the urge to investigate. I followed the tracks, flashlight in hand, the beam slicing through the darkness. The footprints were fresh, and as I ventured deeper into the woods, I noticed that they seemed to be heading towards a clearing. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches clawing at me as if trying to pull me back. The growl returned, this time louder and more intense. I could feel the vibration of it in my chest, and the hairs on my neck stood on end. I pushed forward, my fear overridden by an inexplicable curiosity. The clearing was just ahead, and I could see the moonlight filtering through the trees. When I emerged into the clearing, I froze. The moonlight revealed a horrifying sight, a large, grotesque creature standing in the center of the open space. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, with elongated limbs, sharp claws, and eyes that seemed to glow with a malevolent intelligence. Its skin was mottled and discolored, and it seemed to be covered in patches of bristly fur. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I stared at the creature, my mind struggling to process the sight before me. It was staring back, and in that moment I knew that it was not just a wild animal, but something far more sinister. The creature let out a bone-chilling roar, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The creature advanced slowly, its movements deliberate and unsettling. I turned and sprinted back towards my campsite, the growl echoing behind me. As I ran, I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush, its presence growing closer with each step. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to come alive with each flash. I finally reached my tent, throwing myself inside and zipping it up with shaking hands. The growl stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I lay there, heart pounding, listening for any sign of the creature. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and every rustle of the wind or snap of a twig made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, waiting. Daybreak finally arrived, and the forest was bathed in a pale, weak light. The creature was gone, and the only evidence of its presence were the clawed footprints that led away from my campsite. I packed up quickly, my hands still trembling, and left the Blue Ridge wilderness behind. Since then, I haven't been able to shake the feeling of dread that clings to me like a shadow. The memory of that creature and its malevolent eyes haunts my dreams, and the forest, once a place of peace, has become a symbol of terror. I can't explain what I saw that night, and I've kept the experience to myself, fearing that no one would believe me. The wilderness is vast and full of mysteries, some of which are better left undiscovered. As I sit here, recounting the events of that night, I can't help but wonder if the creature is still out there, lurking in the deep wilderness, waiting for its next encounter. And though I may never return to those woods, the terror of that night remains with me, a chilling reminder of the unknown that lies beyond the safety of the light. I never believed in urban legends. They were the kinds of stories you'd tell around a campfire or late at night to scare your friends, but nothing more. That was until I experienced something that forced me to question everything. It started on a chilly October evening. My name is Alex, and I live in a small town just outside the city. I'd heard the stories growing up, the ones people whispered in school hallways, or the ones you overheard at the local diner. Stories about people who disappeared under strange circumstances, about haunted roads where ghosts of accident victims would appear out of thin air, or about a witch who lived in the woods just beyond town. I thought they were all nonsense. I was wrong. It was a Saturday night, and my friends and I were gathered at my apartment, bored out of our minds. We were tired of the usual Netflix marathons, video games, and pizza nights. That's when Ethan, one of my closest friends, suggested something different. Something he called urban legend hunting. "Let's make a list of the craziest urban legends we know and then test them out," Ethan said, eyes gleaming with mischief. The rest of us laughed at the idea, but there was an undeniable pull in his challenge. Maybe it was the thrill of doing something dangerous, or maybe we just had nothing better to do, but we all agreed. After some brainstorming and Googling, we came up with 3 local legends. The first was the infamous Black Dog of Hollow Creek, a spectral canine that was said to appear to those who were about to die. The second was the Cursed House on the edge of town, an abandoned building where people reportedly heard voices and saw shadows move in the windows, despite it being empty for decades. And the last, the one that made me feel uneasy even as we wrote it down, was the Blood Bridge. It was said that on certain nights, if you drove over it at exactly midnight, you could hear the screams of the woman who had died there years ago, her body found bloodied and broken on the rocks below. We decided to tackle all 3 in one night. The first stop was Hollow Creek. It was a desolate road that ran through a forest, winding alongside a small, murky stream. The legend of the Black Dog was old, passed down through generations. The dog was said to appear out of nowhere, its eyes glowing red, and if you saw it, death would soon follow. We parked at the edge of the forest, the headlights of Ethan's car illuminating the thick trees ahead. There was an eerie stillness in the air as we ventured into the woods. The sound of our footsteps crunching on fallen leaves seemed deafening in the silence. "Anyone see a dog yet?" Sarah, another friend, asked with a nervous laugh. "Not yet," Ethan replied, his bravado faltering slightly as he scanned the darkness. We walked for what felt like hours, but nothing happened. No red-eyed dog, no ominous growling, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Disappointed but relieved, we made our way back to the car. As we reached the clearing, I turned back for one last look at the forest. That's when I saw it. A pair of glowing red eyes staring at me from the shadows of the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The eyes didn't move. They just watched me, unblinking. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a split second I thought I heard a low growl. But when I blinked, the eyes were gone. I didn't tell the others. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe I didn't want to scare them. But something in my gut told me I should have turned back then. Our next stop was the Cursed House, a crumbling old mansion that had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. The story went that the original owners had disappeared without a trace, and anyone who stayed in the house overnight would hear whispers, feel cold hands on their skin, and eventually go mad. Some said it was haunted by the family, trapped there by some dark force. The house was hidden at the end of a long, overgrown driveway. The windows were boarded up, but the front door hung open, creaking in the wind. We hesitated for a moment, exchanging uneasy glances, but Ethan pushed forward. The inside was worse than I imagined. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the stench of mildew. Our flashlights cast eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper, and every step we took echoed through the empty halls. "Let's split up," Ethan suggested, much to my dismay. "It'll be faster." Sarah and I took the upstairs, while Ethan and the others explored the ground floor. The stairs groaned under our weight, and every creak of the old wood made my skin crawl. As we reached the second floor, the temperature seemed to drop. I could see my breath misting in the air. "This place is giving me the creeps," Sarah whispered, sticking close to my side. We opened the door to what looked like a bedroom, the furniture long gone, but the outlines of where a bed and dresser had once been were still visible in the dust on the floor. That's when I heard it. A whisper, faint, almost imperceptible. But there. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with fear. The whisper came again, closer this time, like someone was standing right behind us. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. And then I felt it, a cold hand, brushing against the back of my neck. I yelled, stumbling backward, but there was no one there. Sarah screamed, and we bolted out of the room, racing down the stairs and out of the house as fast as we could. Ethan and the others were already outside, their faces pale. "We heard it too," Ethan said, his voice shaky. "The whispers." We didn't stay to discuss it. We jumped into the car and sped off, the image of that cursed house burned into my mind. But it was the final stop that would haunt me the most. By the time we reached Bloodbridge, it was close to midnight. The legend of the woman who had died there was well known. Some said she had been thrown from the bridge in a jealous rage. Others claimed she had jumped to escape something far worse. Either way, her blood had stained the rocks below, and if you drove over the bridge at the right time, you could still hear her screams. We stopped at the edge of the bridge, the clock on the dashboard ticking closer to midnight. The air was thick with tension, and none of us spoke as we waited. At exactly midnight, Ethan turned the key, and we began to drive slowly across the bridge. The car was dead silent, save for the hum of the engine. I held my breath, listening intently. And then, I heard it. A scream. High-pitched and filled with pain, it echoed through the night. It wasn't just one scream, it was several, overlapping and growing louder by the second. The sound was coming from beneath us, from the rocks below the bridge. Ethan slammed on the brakes, and we all sat there, frozen, as the screams grew louder and louder until it felt like they were inside the car, inside my head. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the screams stopped. We didn't talk on the drive home. We didn't need to. We all knew we had heard the same thing. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that we all went home, shook it off, and laughed about it later. But something changed that night. Ethan died in a car accident 2 weeks later. Sarah moved away and stopped responding to messages. As for me, I haven't slept well since. Every night I hear whispers. I see red eyes watching me from the dark corners of my room. And sometimes, just before I drift off to sleep, I hear the screams. Urban legends aren't just stories. They're warnings. I woke up to the sound of something breaking downstairs. My heart raced as I lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling, trying to gather my senses. It wasn't unusual for me to hear strange noises in the middle of the night. I lived alone in an old house on the outskirts of town, and the creaks and groans of the wooden structure had become a kind of twisted lullaby. But this time, it was different. This was sharp, deliberate, like glass shattering. I sat up, the cold night air pressing against my skin. My breath hung in the air, my chest tight with unease. I listened, straining to catch any other noise, but the house fell silent again. Maybe I imagined it. I hadn't been sleeping well for weeks now. It wasn't that I wasn't tired, quite the opposite. It was more like my body refused to stay asleep. I'd wake up with a start, unsure of how much time had passed, my sheets soaked with sweat. But that noise, I couldn't ignore it. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stepped onto the hardwood floor, wincing as it creaked beneath my weight. Slowly, I made my way toward the staircase, trying not to think about the shadows that danced in my peripheral vision. As I descended the steps, the faint moonlight from the window cast long, distorted shapes on the walls, giving the house an almost malevolent presence. In the kitchen, I found it. A shattered glass on the floor, the remnants of a late-night drink. My heart still pounded in my chest, but I exhaled in relief. It must have been me, I told myself. Maybe I knocked it over earlier and didn't notice. Maybe Then I saw the blood. My pulse quickened again as I stepped closer. There was a thin trail of it leading from the broken glass toward the back door. It wasn't much, but enough to make my stomach turn. My mind raced. Had someone broken in? Was I injured and just didn't notice in the confusion? My body felt fine. No cuts, no pain. Yet the blood was undeniable, fresh and bright against the pale kitchen tiles. The back door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the night breeze. I hadn't left it open. My instincts told me to close it, lock it, and retreat upstairs to safety. But instead, I stepped outside. The cold air stung my skin as I stood on the back porch, scanning the yard. The moon hung low, casting its dim light over the barren landscape. Everything looked still, yet something felt terribly wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I swallowed hard, the metallic taste of fear filling my mouth. That's when I saw the footprints, bare feet, leading away from the house and into the woods beyond the yard. They were smeared with blood. My own blood. I stood there, staring at the prints, my brain struggling to make sense of it all. Had someone attacked me while I was asleep? But then, why was the blood in the kitchen? Why were there no signs of struggle? And more importantly, why couldn't I remember anything? I followed the trail of footprints, my body moving on autopilot as my mind raced through possibilities. My feet crunched on the dead leaves beneath me, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. The woods behind my house were dense and unforgiving, a place I rarely ventured during the day, let alone in the dead of night. But something compelled me forward, an inexplicable urge to know what was waiting at the end of those bloody prints. The further I walked, the more my unease grew. I didn't know where I was going, but my body seemed to. The trees closed in around me, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching down to pull me deeper into the forest's embrace. My breath became ragged, each step harder than the last, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Finally, I reached a small clearing, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. And there, at the center of the clearing, was a figure. It was me. No, someone who looked like me. He stood there, facing away from me, his body hunched over something on the ground. My heart stopped in my chest as I watched myself, kneel over a crumpled shape. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer, the leaves crunching beneath me. The figure froze, slowly turning his head to look at me. His face, my face, was twisted in a grotesque grin, blood smeared across his lips. His eyes, wide and unblinking, bore into mine, and I felt a scream building in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then he spoke. "You're late." His voice was mine, but distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. The figure stood, towering over the body on the ground, and I finally saw what he, or I, had been kneeling over. It was a person, a woman. Her body was twisted in unnatural angles, her throat slashed, her eyes wide open in eternal terror. And my hands were covered in her blood. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. This couldn't be real. I had never seen this woman before in my life. I couldn't have done this. But the evidence was there, undeniable and horrifying. The figure, still grinning that monstrous grin, took a step toward me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. He raised a blood-soaked hand and pointed at me. "You've been busy," he said, his voice dripping with malice. I fell to my knees, the world spinning around me. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I hadn't left my bed. I hadn't left my house. But deep down, I knew the truth. The sleepwalking, the blackouts, the strange feelings when I woke up, disoriented and drenched in sweat. I had ignored the signs, convinced myself it was nothing more than stress, maybe exhaustion. But now, looking at the blood on my hands, at the woman's lifeless body, I knew. It was me. I had done this. The figure, the other me, stepped closer, his breath hot against my skin. "You're not done yet," he whispered, his voice crawling into my ears like a living thing. "We're just getting started." I scrambled to my feet, my mind a whirlwind of horror and disbelief. I had to leave, get out of these woods, out of this nightmare. But as I turned to run, I felt a hand on my shoulder. "You can't run from yourself," he said softly. I spun around, but the figure was gone. The clearing was empty, save for the woman's body at my feet. I ran. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, branches tearing at my skin, the cold air burning in my lungs. I didn't stop until I burst through the trees and back into the yard, my house looming ahead of me like a safe haven. But I knew the truth now. There was no escaping this. No locking the door behind me would keep it out, because the monster was inside me. That night, I didn't sleep. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard his voice, my voice, whispering in my ear, reminding me that this wasn't over, that I couldn't outrun what was coming. The sleepwalking wasn't just a symptom, it was a warning. And next time, I wouldn't wake up in time to stop myself, because the night was no longer mine. It was his. I still hear the screams in my head, even though it's been 10 years since that winter night. Every time the wind howls through the trees, it brings back the echo of those desperate cries, the ones no one else heard, except for me. It all began with a dare. There's something about small towns like ours, buried deep in the northern woods, where the winters are longer than the summers, and the cold clings to your bones. It breeds a certain kind of boredom, one that makes you reckless. So when my friends, Mark and Jake, suggested a weekend trip into the wilderness just outside of town, I didn't hesitate. We were 17, thought we were invincible, and the stories we grew up with were nothing but campfire tales to scare younger kids. Except one story stood out. The tale of the Wendigo. A creature from Native American folklore, the Wendigo was said to be a spirit of hunger and cold, lurking in the deep woods. It was rumored to possess people, turning them into monsters driven by an insatiable craving for human flesh. Our parents always warned us to stay away from the old hunting grounds, but of course that's where we were headed. It wasn't enough to camp in the woods. Mark wanted us to spend the night where, according to legend, the last Wendigo sighting occurred. This is how urban legends start. Jake had laughed as we packed up the truck. 3 idiots vanish in the woods, never to be seen again. I shrugged it off, but there was something unsettling about his joke. I wasn't superstitious, but those woods had a way of making you feel watched, even in broad daylight. We reached the spot late afternoon, the sun already sinking behind the dense trees. There was a chill in the air, colder than it should have been for that time of year. I felt it then, the unease creeping in as we set up camp. Mark and Jake joked around, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. By nightfall, the wind had picked up, making the trees groan and creak. We huddled around the fire, trying to stave off the biting cold, as Mark began to tell the story we all knew too well. They say the Wendigo only comes out in winter, when the nights are long and the hunger is deep. He began, his voice low. It starts as a whisper in your ear, a call from the wind. You follow it, even though you know you shouldn't. And by the time you realize it's not your own thoughts, it's too late. You've already let it in. Jake threw a handful of pine needles into the fire, sending a spray of sparks into the night. You really believe that crap? He asked, smirking. Mark grinned. I don't have to believe it. We're here, aren't we? We laughed it off, but I noticed the way Jake's eyes darted into the darkness beyond the firelight. I felt it too, the pull of the woods, as though something was lurking just out of sight. The wind howled, and I swear I heard my name in it, whispered so faintly I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. Almost. We turned in for the night, crawling into our tents and zipping them tight against the cold. But sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it, the wind, the faint voice calling my name. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. It was so soft, like someone was whispering just outside the tent. "Jake? Mark?" I called out, but there was no response. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. The fire had died down to embers, and the forest was bathed in shadow. I strained my ears, listening. Then I saw it. A shape, just beyond the trees, standing unnaturally still. My breath caught in my throat. "Mark? Jake?" I called again, louder this time. The shape didn't move. For a moment I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But then it shifted, just slightly, like it was waiting for something. I scrambled out of the tent, my heart racing. "Mark!" I shouted. No answer. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the dark. I swung it toward the trees, but the shape was gone. The wind picked up again, more intense this time, and with it, that voice, clearer now, like someone was right behind me whispering my name. I spun around, but there was no one there. "Mark! Jake!" I shouted again, panic rising in my chest. Then I heard it, a scream, sharp and high-pitched, cutting through the night. It came from the direction of Jake's tent. I bolted toward it, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. When I reached the tent, it was empty, the flap torn open, the inside shredded as though something had clawed its way in. My blood ran cold. "Jake!" I yelled into the trees, my voice cracking. Another scream, farther away this time. Mark's tent was next. I raced over, but it too was torn apart, empty. My friends were gone. The wind howled again, louder now, and in it I heard not just my name but something else. A low, guttural growl, inhuman and hungry. I backed away from the camp, the flashlight flickering. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled into the trees, driven by some primal instinct to run. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. But the deeper I went into the woods, the louder the growling became. And then I saw it. Standing just ahead, bathed in the dim moonlight filtering through the trees, was the Wendigo. Its body was twisted and emaciated, skin stretched taut over bones that jutted at unnatural angles. Its eyes, sunken deep into its skull, glowed with a cold, malevolent hunger. But what struck me most were its teeth, sharp, jagged, dripping with blood. Jake's blood. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My legs refused to move as the creature took a step toward me, its long, bony fingers stretching out. The air around me grew colder, and the voice I had heard in the wind, was now clear, unmistakable, and terrifyingly close. It wasn't calling my name anymore. It was telling me to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear as the Wendigo closed the distance between us. Its breath was rancid, like rotting flesh, and I could see every horrific detail of its face now, the skin peeling away to reveal bone beneath. In that moment, just as its fingers grazed my arm, I heard another scream. Not Jake's, not Mark's, my own. I don't remember what happened after that. I must have blacked out because when I woke up, the sun was rising, casting an eerie light through the trees. I was lying in the snow, alone. There was no sign of Mark or Jake, no sign of the creature. Just me in the silence of the forest. They never found my friends. The police said it was an animal attack, that we were careless venturing so deep into the wilderness. But I know the truth. The Wendigo took them. It almost took me too, and sometimes when the wind howls late at night, I hear it calling me back.